You're listening to Lanterns Within Audio. And now, the story begins. The first thing I noticed was not the message. It was the silence that followed it. My wife, Hannah Carter, had been laughing at something on her phone while we cleaned up after dinner. Then her smile disappeared. She stared at the screen for only a second before quickly tapping it. One message, one simple swipe, deleted. She locked her phone, slipped it in her sweater pocket, and looked at me with a smile that arrived just a little too late. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just spam," she answered casually. I nodded, but something inside me refused to move on. We had been married for 9 years. We lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, where our lives had settled into the comfortable rhythm most couples dream about. I taught architecture at a community college. Hannah owned a small floral design studio that somehow managed to make every wedding she touched look magical. We were not wealthy, but we were happy. At least, I believed we were. Until that Tuesday evening. It's strange how quickly the mind can build an entire story from almost nothing. A deleted message became a secret. A secret became a lie. A lie became someone else. I hated myself for thinking that way, yet the thought refused to leave. The next morning, Hannah kissed me goodbye before opening the flower shop. She looked exactly the same as she always had. Soft blonde hair tied loosely behind her head. Green eyes that usually made me feel at home. The faint smell of fresh roses that followed her everywhere. Nothing about her seemed different. Everything about me did. During my lunch break, I found myself scrolling through old photographs instead of grading assignments. Vacations along the Oregon coast. Christmas mornings with our golden retriever, Murphy. Countless ordinary moments that had somehow become extraordinary simply because we had shared them together. I kept asking myself one question. Why would someone with nothing to hide delete a message so quickly? That evening, Hannah came home carrying a bouquet of leftover peonies from the shop. She always brought home flowers that customers had decided not to buy. They still deserve a home, she liked to say. She placed the bouquet in a glass vase before walking over to me. "You seem quiet today." "Long day." The lie surprised even me. She studied my face for a moment as if she sensed something had changed. Then she simply rested her head against my shoulder. "Tomorrow will be better." I wanted to believe her. Instead, my eyes drifted toward the phone resting on the kitchen counter. After she went upstairs to shower, it buzzed once. Just once. The screen lit up. A name appeared before the notification disappeared almost instantly. I only caught the first 3 letters. Illy. Then the phone went dark again. My heartbeat became louder than the water running upstairs. I stood there longer than I should have. I had never looked through Hannah's phone before. Not once in 9 years. Trust had never required proof. Yet that evening my hand actually moved toward it. I stopped only inches away. Murphy wandered into the kitchen and gently rested his head against my leg, almost as if reminding me who I had always been. I pulled my hand back. When Hannah came downstairs, her hair was still damp. She smiled when she saw me petting Murphy. "You two always look guilty together." I forced a laugh. "Maybe we are." She walked over, picked up her phone, and slipped it back in her pocket without checking the screen. Another tiny moment. Another tiny crack. Later that night, while Hannah slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My imagination kept replaying that deleted message over and over again. I tried convincing myself it had probably been exactly what she said it was. Spam. A wrong number. A customer canceling an order. Anything ordinary. But doubt rarely accepts ordinary answers. Around 2 in the morning, I quietly climbed out of bed and walked downstairs. The house was completely still. Moonlight spilled through the living room windows, illuminating the vase of peonies Hannah had rescued earlier that evening. I stood there looking at them, remembering something she had once told me during our first year of marriage. Flowers never stay beautiful because you hold on to them tighter. They stay beautiful because you take care of them every day. At the time, I thought she was talking about roses. Standing alone in the silence of our home, I suddenly realized she had been talking about us. Upstairs, I heard Hannah stir in her sleep before everything became quiet again. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath, and made a decision. Whatever that deleted message meant, I would not let suspicion write the ending of our story before I knew the truth. I just did not realize that by the time the truth finally reached me, one missing message would become the only reason our marriage survived. The following morning, I left for work earlier than usual, hoping a change of routine might quiet the thoughts that had followed me through the night. It did not. Every lecture I gave felt strangely distant, as though part of my mind had remained in our kitchen beside Hannah's phone. I caught myself staring out the classroom window more than once while my students worked on their design projects. During a short break, my colleague Daniel dropped into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look terrible," he joked as he handed me one. "Long night. Everything all right at home?" I hesitated for only a second before forcing a smile. "Just not sleeping well." He accepted the answer without asking another question, but I hated how easily the lie had left my mouth. Hannah and I had always promised ourselves that our marriage would never become the kind where silence slowly replaced honesty. Yet here I was, hiding my fears before I had even spoken them aloud. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was Hannah. "I am bringing lunch to the shop next door. If you're free later, stop by. I saved your favorite blueberry muffin." I stared at the message longer than necessary. There were no hidden meanings. No extrañe wording. Just Hannah being Hannah. I almost laughed at myself for the suspicion that had consumed me since yesterday. By late afternoon, I decided to surprise her instead. On my way home, I stopped by the flower shop carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate from the cafe across the street. Through the front window, I saw Hannah arranging white lilies while talking with someone, whose back was turned toward me. A tall man wearing a charcoal coat. His posture was relaxed, almost familiar. Before I reached the door, Hannah glanced toward the window. The smile on her face disappeared for the briefest moment. She quickly walked around the counter and stepped outside before I could enter. "What are you doing here?" she asked with a smile that seemed just a little too careful. "Bringing you hot chocolate." She accepted the cup, but her eyes briefly drifted toward the man, still inside. "That was sweet." "Busy." "A little." I looked past her shoulder. "Customer." "Sort of." The answer felt oddly incomplete. Before I could ask anything else, the man picked up a small envelope from the counter, nodded politely toward Hannah, and walked toward the back exit instead of coming through the front. I barely caught a glimpse of his face before he disappeared. Hannah noticed me watching him. "He is helping with something for the shop." "What kind of something?" She tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Nothing exciting. I will tell you later." There was again. Later. Another promise postponed. We stood in silence for a few seconds before she leaned forward and kissed my cheek. "Thank you for the hot chocolate." "You are welcome." I drove home feeling more confused than before. If she had wanted to hide the meeting, why stand outside with me at all? But if there was nothing to hide, why not introduce me? That evening we ate dinner together, talked about Murphy chasing squirrels in the backyard, laughed about a wedding client who wanted sunflowers in December, and folded laundry while listening to an old jazz playlist we both loved. From the outside, nothing about our marriage looked broken. Yet every ordinary moment now carried an invisible question beneath it. After dinner, Hannah's phone buzzed again. This time she looked directly at the screen, quietly stood up, and walked onto the back porch before answering it. She spoke softly enough that I could not hear a single word through the glass door. Murphy wandered over and sat beside me, watching the porch with the same quiet curiosity I felt. 5 minutes later, Hannah returned. "Everything okay?" I asked. She nodded almost immediately. "Just something for work." I wanted to ask more. I wanted to tell her how frightened I had become of all the little things she was choosing not to share. Instead, I simply nodded. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I noticed her standing alone in our bedroom, holding the same small envelope I had seen the man collect at the flower shop. She slipped it into the bottom drawer of her dresser the moment she realized I was standing in the doorway. She smiled gently. "Ready for bed?" I smiled back, but something inside me quietly sank. It was not the envelope itself that hurt. It was realizing that, for the first time since we had promised to build a life without secrets, I no longer knew which parts of my wife's life still belonged to both of us, and which parts she had decided to carry alone. By Friday, I had become someone I barely recognized. Not because Hannah had changed, but because every ordinary moment now carried the weight of a question I could not answer. She smiled. I wondered if it was real. She answered a phone call. I wondered who was on the other end. She left 10 minutes early for work. I wondered where she was really going. Suspicion is strange. It doesn't arrive all at once. It settles quietly into every corner of your mind until nothing feels innocent anymore. Saturday morning began the way it always had. Hannah stood in the kitchen making pancakes while Murphy waited patiently beside the stove, hoping something might accidentally fall to the floor. She laughed when he nudged her leg with his nose. "You're the worst helper I've ever had." Murphy wagged his tail proudly as if taking it as a compliment. I watched them from the dining table and felt an unexpected ache in my chest. This was the woman who remembered every birthday in my family. The woman who still packed my lunch whenever she knew I had a long day at the college. The woman who cried during animated movies because she couldn't bear seeing anyone lonely. Was I really beginning to believe she was living a second life without me? After breakfast, Hannah checked the time. I need to stop by the studio for a couple of hours. On Saturday, one of the wedding installations changed at the last minute. She leaned over and kissed my forehead. I won't be long. As soon as the front door closed, I sat perfectly still. My coffee had already gone cold. Every part of me knew I should trust her. Another part whispered that this might be the chance to finally understand what had been happening. I hated that the second voice was louder. Almost without thinking, I grabbed my keys. I stayed several cars behind her as she drove across town. She never looked in the rearview mirror. After 20 minutes, she pulled into a quiet neighborhood I had never visited before. There was no flower shop, no wedding venue, just a small brick building with a blue sign above the entrance. Portland Family Cancer Center. My heart immediately sank, though not in the way I expected. Hannah parked, picked up a large paper gift bag from the back seat, and walked inside. I remained across the street, confused. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the same man from the flower shop arrived, carrying 2 grocery bags. It was him, the man in the charcoal coat. He greeted the receptionist before disappearing down the hallway. 15 minutes later, I watched him and Hannah leave the building together. They were smiling. She handed him one of the envelopes I'd seen earlier. He thanked her with a warm hug that lasted only a second before they walked towards separate cars. Nothing about it looked romantic. Nothing about it answered my questions either. Before I could decide whether to leave, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "Where are you?" "Out running errands." "I thought today was your anniversary dinner with Hannah." My stomach tightened. Anniversary. I looked at the date on my dashboard. Daniel was right. 9 years ago that afternoon, Hannah and I had signed our marriage license at the courthouse before celebrating with burgers because we couldn't afford anything else. I had completely forgotten. I turned the car around immediately. By the time I reached home, Hannah was already there. Candles flickered gently across the dining table. She had cooked my favorite lemon herb salmon, baked fresh bread, and even found the inexpensive bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir we had shared on our first anniversary. She smiled the moment I walked through the door. I was starting to worry. Shame crashed over me so suddenly that I could barely meet her eyes. While she had spent the day preparing a surprise for us, I had spent it following her across the city. We sat down for dinner. Halfway through the meal, Hannah reached beneath the table and handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook with my initials embossed on the cover. "For your designs," she said softly. "I know you've been filling notebooks faster than you can buy them." I looked at her for a long moment. "You remembered." She laughed gently. "Of course I remembered." Then she tilted her head slightly. "Did you?" The question was playful. My silence was not. Before I could answer, Hannah's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She looked at the screen. The warmth in her smile faded for just a moment. Without opening the message, she picked up the phone, turned it face down, and quietly whispered, "Not tonight." I wanted to believe those words were meant for whoever had texted her. Instead, I found myself wondering if they were meant for me. The anniversary dinner should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it left me feeling even more ashamed. Hannah had remembered everything. I had forgotten the date, spent the afternoon following her across the city, and walked into our home carrying suspicion instead of gratitude. Yet the unanswered questions refused to disappear. Long after we finished dinner, I found myself standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes while Hannah wrapped the leftover salmon for tomorrow's lunch. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was careful, as if both of us sensed there was something waiting to be said, but neither knew how to begin. "You've been distracted all week," Hannah finally said without looking up. I dried my hands on a towel. "Have I?" She smiled softly. "You forget your coffee in the microwave. You leave lights on. Yesterday, you called Murphy by your brother's name." A small laugh escaped me despite everything. "I did. Twice." For a moment, we both smiled. Then, the smile slowly faded. Hannah looked at me with the same gentle expression she had worn on our wedding day. "Is something worrying you?" The question caught me completely off guard. I could have told her everything. About the deleted message. About the man in the charcoal coat. About the hospital. About following her across town. Instead, I heard myself say, "Work has just been busy." Another lie. Hannah nodded quietly, though I could tell she didn't believe it. She stepped closer, resting her hand lightly against my arm. "Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." The words stayed with me long after we went to bed, because they sounded painfully ironic. She believed I was carrying something alone. I believed she was doing exactly the same thing. Monday morning arrived with heavy rain. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message from Hannah. "Asterisk, can you stop by the flower shop around 5? I need your opinion on something." Asterisk, it was the first time in days she had asked me to come there. I spent the rest of the afternoon wondering what had changed. When I arrived, the shop was empty except for Hannah arranging winter greenery near the front window. She smiled as soon as she saw me. Perfect timing. For what? "Help me choose." She pointed toward 3 different holiday wreaths lined against the wall. "The hotel downtown wants one design for their Christmas lobby." For nearly 20 minutes, we talked about ribbon colors, cedar branches, and white berries. It felt wonderfully ordinary. The version of us I had been missing all week quietly returned. Then the front door opened. The bell above it chimed softly. The same man in the charcoal coat walked inside. This time I saw his face clearly. Mid-40s. Kind eyes. A neatly trimmed beard. He smiled politely when he noticed me. Hannah's expression changed ever so slightly. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to concern. "David," she said carefully, "this is Eli." He extended his hand. "Nice to finally meet you." I shook it automatically. "Likewise." Before I could ask how they knew each other, Hannah disappeared into the office at the back of the shop. Eli remained near the counter, studying the holiday arrangements. Neither of us spoke for several awkward seconds. Finally, he smiled. "She's incredibly talented." "She is." Another silence settled between us. It was Eli who broke it. "You're a lucky man." I thanked him politely, but something about the sentence unsettled me. It sounded less like a compliment and more like someone reminding himself of something he wished he hadn't forgotten. Hannah returned, carrying the familiar cream-colored envelope. She handed it to Eli without saying a word. He accepted it gently, almost carefully, slipping it inside his coat instead of opening it immediately. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Hannah simply nodded. No hug this time. No unnecessary conversation. Eli gave both of us a small wave before leaving the shop. I watched through the window as he walked slowly across the rain-soaked parking lot before disappearing into an older blue pickup truck. Hannah remained standing beside me, looking out at the rain. Neither of us spoke until his truck had completely vanished. Then, without warning, she whispered something so softly I almost missed it. I wish none of this had ever happened. My heart tightened. "Hannah." She turned toward me with tired eyes. For one brief second, I thought she was finally going to tell me everything. Instead, the phone in her apron vibrated again. She looked at the screen. The color drained from her face. Without saying a word, she grabbed her coat, locked the shop, and looked back at me. "David." Her voice trembled for the first time all week. "I have to go." "Go where?" She hesitated. Then she quietly answered, "To the hospital." Before I could ask another question, she was already running through the rain toward her car, leaving me standing alone outside the flower shop with more questions than ever before. For several seconds after Hannah drove away, I remained standing in the rain outside the flower shop. The taillights of her car disappeared around the corner, leaving only the sound of water falling against the empty parking lot. To the hospital, those were the only words she had given me. No explanation, no destination, no promise that she would. Tell me everything later. I looked through the shop window one last time before locking the front door exactly as Hannah had asked. The flowers inside stood quietly beneath the warm lights, completely unaware that the life I believed I understood seemed to be slipping further away with every passing hour. During the drive home, my phone stayed silent. I kept expecting Hannah to call. She never did. Murphy greeted me at the front door with his usual excitement, but even he seemed to sense something was different when I absent-mindedly forgot to fill his food bowl. After feeding him, I sat alone in the living room staring at the empty chair across from me. 9 years of marriage should have taught me to trust the woman I loved. Instead, every unanswered question fed another impossible theory. Around 8 o'clock, my phone finally rang. Hannah's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "Are you okay?" There was a brief silence before she spoke. "I'm okay." Her voice sounded exhausted. "Will you be home soon?" "I'm not sure. Can you tell me what's happening?" Another pause. I could hear hospital announcements echoing faintly in the background. "I wish I could." The sentence landed harder than I expected. "You wish you could?" I repeated quietly. "Or you won't." She inhaled slowly. "There's a difference." Before I could respond, someone called her name from distance. "I have to go," she whispered. "I'll explain everything." When the line remained silent for just a second too long. Soon, then the call ended. I lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen. Soon, later, it's complicated. Those words have become the entire language of our marriage. The next morning I woke after only a few hours of restless sleep. Hannah still wasn't home. A handwritten note rested on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker. Asterisk emergency at the hospital. Don't wait up. I love you. Asterisk I read the last 3 words several times. I love you. The words had never sounded so reassuring and so confusing at the same time. At work, I accomplished almost nothing. Daniel eventually closed my office door and sat across from me. "Okay," he said calmly. "What's really going on?" I hesitated. Then, for the first time all week, I told someone the truth. Not every detail, just enough. The deleted message, the mysterious man, the hospital, the envelopes. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Have you asked her?" "Not really." "Why?" I rubbed my forehead. "Because I'm afraid of the answer." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Or maybe you're afraid you've already decided what the answer is." His words stayed with me for the rest of the day. That evening, instead of driving home, I found myself turning into the parking lot of Portland Family Cancer Center again. I told myself I wasn't following Hannah. I simply needed the truth. Through the large glass windows near the reception area, I saw her sitting beside a hospital bed. The patient was an older woman with silver hair, whose face looked painfully thin. Hannah gently adjusted her blanket before taking her hand. A few moments later, Eli entered the room carrying fresh flowers from the shop. He placed them beside the bed before sitting quietly on the opposite side. No one spoke for a long time. They simply remained there together, surrounding the woman with a silence that somehow felt full of love instead of secrets. I stood frozen behind glass, unable to hear a single word. Then the older woman slowly reached for Hannah's hand with one trembling arm and for Eli's with the other. She carefully brought both of their hands together. Hannah immediately lowered her head and began crying. Eli closed his eyes, fighting tears of his own. The older woman's lips moved gently. I couldn't hear what she said, but whatever those words were, they shattered something inside both of them. Before I realized what I was doing, I stepped toward the entrance. Then I stopped. This wasn't my moment. I didn't belong inside that room. I turned away and walked back toward my car, more confused than ever. If Eli was another man in Hannah's life, why did everything I just witnessed look so much like a family saying goodbye? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the older woman's trembling hands pulling Hannah's and Eli's together. Whatever connected them, it was far deeper than the story I had been telling myself all week. The next morning, Hannah was already awake when I came downstairs. She stood by the kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee, still wearing the same sweater she had left the house in the day before. Her eyes were tired. So were mine. "You came home late," I said quietly. She nodded. "Around 3. Neither of us mentioned the hospital. Neither of us mentioned Eli. Murphy wandered between us carrying his favorite tennis ball, completely unaware that two people who loved each other were slowly being buried beneath everything they were afraid to say. Hannah knelt to pet him before looking back at me. "Can we have dinner together tonight? Just us. Just us." I wanted to believe she was finally ready to explain everything. "Okay." She gave me a grateful smile before leaving for the flower shop. Throughout the day, I found it impossible to concentrate. Shortly after lunch, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello, David." The voice belonged to Eli. I immediately recognized it. Every muscle in my body tightened. "This is Eli." "I know." There was a brief silence. "I was hoping we could meet." "Why?" "Because Hannah won't tell you the truth." My heartbeat quickened. "Then you tell me." "Not over the phone." He suggested a small coffee shop only a few blocks from the cancer center. I arrived 15 minutes early. Eli walked in carrying 2 paper cups. He looked even more exhausted than he had at the flower shop. After sitting down, neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, he pushed one of the coffees toward me. "I don't expect you to trust me." "You're right." He nodded. "I wouldn't either." He stared at the table for a long moment before quietly saying, "The woman you saw yesterday. Who is she?" I asked. His eyes filled almost immediately. "Our mother." I blinked. "Your mother?" He nodded again. "Mine and Hannah's." Every thought I had built over the past week collapsed in an instant. Hannah never told me she had a brother. Because for 15 years, his voice broke. She hasn't. He explained that he and Hannah had grown up in a difficult home after their father died. Their mother struggled with alcoholism for years, and the family slowly fell apart. During one violent argument shortly after Hannah turned 20, Eli chose to leave with their mother, believing he could help her recover. Hannah felt abandoned. She packed her belongings, moved to Portland, and cut off all contact. Months became years. Years became silence. By the time Hannah and I met, that chapter of her life had already been buried. "She never wanted anyone to know," Eli said quietly. "Especially you." I stared at him, unable to speak. "Last month," he continued, "our mother was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer." The words hung heavily between us. "She asked for Hannah." He looked down at his hands. At first, Hannah refused. "Then why is she there now?" Eli reached into his coat pocket and removed his phone. He opened a message before turning the screen toward me. My eyes immediately recognized the date. Tuesday evening. The same night Hannah had deleted the message. It read, "The cancer has spread faster than expected. If Hannah wants to say goodbye, she may not have much time left." My throat tightened. She deleted that. Eli nodded slowly. She wasn't trying to hide me. He looked directly into my eyes. She was trying to hide her pain. I suddenly remembered every small moment from the past week. The deleted message, the phone calls, the envelopes, the hospital. None of them had anything to do with another relationship. They were all pieces of family Hannah had spent 15 years trying to forget. "Why didn't she tell me?" I whispered. Eli gave a tired smile. "Because she's afraid that if you see where she came from." He paused before quietly finishing the sentence. "You might see her differently." I immediately shook my head. "Never." Eli looked at me with a sadness that seemed far older than either of us. "Then tell her that." As I drove home, the guilt settled over me more heavily than any suspicion ever had. All week, I had been searching for evidence that my wife no longer trusted me. I had never stopped to wonder whether she was simply carrying a heartbreak she didn't yet know how to share. When I pulled into our driveway, Hannah's car was already there. Through the front window, I could see her setting the dinner table for 2. She looked exactly as she always had. But for the first time in days, I realized I was no longer looking at a woman keeping secrets from me. I was looking at a woman standing alone in the middle of a goodbye she had never expected to face. For several minutes, I remained in the driveway without turning off the engine. The porch light glowed warmly through the front window. Inside, Hannah moved quietly between the kitchen and dining room, placing 2 plates on the table exactly as she had promised that morning. Looking at her now, it was difficult to believe how completely I had misunderstood the past week. Yet another realization hurt even more. Hannah had carried this entire burden alone because she believed she had to. I finally stepped inside. Hannah looked up and smiled, though I could immediately see how exhausted she was. "Dinner's almost ready," she said softly. I placed my keys on the counter. "I met Eli today." Her hands froze. The serving spoon slipped from her fingers and landed softly against the countertop. For a long moment, she simply stared at me. "He called you?" she whispered. I nodded. "We talked." She slowly pulled out a chair and sat down, as though the strength had quietly left her legs. "I wanted to tell you." "I know." Tears immediately gathered in her eyes. I just didn't know how. I walked over and sat across from her. Neither of us reached for the food. "Why didn't you ever tell me you had a brother?" She lowered her eyes toward the table. "Because I spent 15 years pretending I didn't." Her voice was calm, but every word carried years of pain. She told me about the night everything had fallen apart. After their father's death, their mother had spiraled into addiction. Bills went unpaid. Arguments became normal. Some nights, there was no electricity. Other nights, there was barely enough food. Eli had been only 22 when he decided to stay behind and care for their mother. Hannah had begged him to leave with her. He refused. She took that refusal as betrayal. "I thought he chose her instead of me," she admitted. "So I left." She looked at her wedding ring before continuing. "When I met you, I had already built another life. A better life. Every year that passed made it harder to explain why my own family no longer existed in my stories." I quietly reached across the table and took her hand. "You never had to protect me from your past." Hannah looked at me with tear-filled eyes. "I wasn't protecting you." She paused. "I was protecting the version of myself you fell in love with." The words broke something inside me. "Hannah," I kept thinking. She struggled to continue. "What if you looked at me differently after knowing where I came from? What if every happy memory we built suddenly had this darkness behind it?" I gently squeezed her hand. "Nothing about your past changes the woman sitting in front of me." She closed her eyes as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. Then why couldn't I believe that? Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I asked the question that had stayed with me since leaving the coffee shop. "The envelopes." A faint smile appeared through her tears. "Letters. Letters." She nodded. "Mom can't speak for very long anymore. Some days she loses her voice completely. She wanted to write while she still could." Hannah stood up, walked quietly to the hallway cabinet, and returned carrying the same cream-colored envelope I had seen so many times. She carefully opened it and handed me a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky but neat. Asterisk, "Dear Hannah, I know I lost the right to call myself your mother many years ago. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I only hope you will someday believe that not a single day passed without me wishing I had been the mother you deserved." Asterisk, I stopped reading. My vision blurred. Hannah looked out the window before speaking again. "There are 17 letters. One for every year since I left home." She wrote them. Hannah nodded. "She started after her first year of sobriety." "Why didn't Eli send them?" "Because she told him not to." Hannah smiled sadly. "She believed I deserved a peaceful life without being dragged back into old wounds." I suddenly understood the envelopes. They weren't legal documents. They weren't secrets between lovers. They were 17 years of apologies that had never found their way home. Hannah quietly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. "Yesterday," she whispered, "she asked me if I could ever forgive her before she dies." Her voice cracked, and I still don't know the answer. I walked around the table and wrapped my arms around her. For the first time all week, she didn't try to stay strong. She buried her face against my shoulder and cried without saying another word. As I held my wife, I realized the greatest distance between two people is not created by anger. It is created by believing your deepest pain is something you have to survive alone. That night, neither Hannah nor I slept very much. She lay quietly beside me, her breathing uneven, while I stared into the darkness, thinking about the 17 unopened years that had quietly existed outside our marriage. Around 3 in the morning, I felt Hannah slip out of bed. A few moments later, I found her sitting alone on the back porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the rain fall softly across the yard. I sat beside her without saying anything. Sometimes love doesn't begin with advice. Sometimes it begins with simply refusing to leave. After several minutes, Hannah spoke. "Do you know what I remember most?" I shook my head. Not the shouting. Her voice was almost a whisper. Not the nights we had no electricity. She looked toward the rain. I remember my mother singing while she braided my hair before school. A small smile appeared through her tears. She had a terrible voice. I smiled gently. "Really?" Hannah nodded. She always forgot the words halfway through every song. Her smile slowly disappeared. "That's the woman I keep trying to remember." She lowered her head. "But every time I get close, all I can see is everything that came after." I reached for her hand. "Both memories can be true." She looked at me. "Someone can love you and still hurt you." Tears rolled quietly down her face. That's the part I've never known how to forgive. The following afternoon, Hannah received another call from the hospital. She listened, silently before thanking the nurse and ending the conversation. "She's asking for me again," Hannah said. "Do you want to go?" Hannah stared at the phone for a long time. "I don't know." I walked over and gently held both of her hands. "Then don't go because someone expects you to." She looked into my eyes. "Go only if one day you might regret not going." She didn't answer immediately. Nearly a full minute passed before she quietly nodded. An hour later, we walked through the familiar entrance of Portland Family Cancer Center together. Eli was already there, sitting alone outside the room. He stood as soon as he saw Hannah. Neither of them moved for several seconds. Finally, Eli spoke. "She's awake." Hannah's voice trembled. "Is she in pain?" He nodded honestly. "Some days are harder than others." Hannah closed her eyes for a moment before taking a slow breath. "Will you come with me?" she asked. Eli looked surprised. "Only if you want me there." She reached for his hand. "I don't want to walk in alone." It was the first time they had touched in 15 years. Neither of them said anything else. They simply walked into the room together. I remained outside, giving them the space they deserved. Through the partially open door, I could see the older woman resting against her pillows. Her face looked thinner than before, but her eyes immediately filled with tears the moment she saw Hannah. She slowly lifted one trembling hand. Hannah stood frozen near the doorway. For a second, I thought she might turn around and leave. Instead, she crossed the room one careful step at a time until she reached the bedside. The older woman gently touched Hannah's face as though trying to memorize it. Her voice was barely audible. "You still look like your father." Hannah let out a broken laugh through her tears. "Everyone says I have your eyes." The older woman smiled weakly. "I've missed them every day." No dramatic speeches followed. No instant vergivnis. Only quiet honesty. The kind that arrives after years of carrying words too heavy to speak. I watched Eli quietly leave the room, giving his mother and sister a few precious moments alone. He sat beside me in the hallway, without saying anything. After several minutes, he finally spoke. She kept every birthday card Hannah ever made as a little girl. I looked at him, even after she left. He nodded. She read them every birthday. He smiled sadly. She never stopped being our mother. Then his expression changed. She just stopped knowing how. Nearly an hour later, Hannah stepped out of the room. Her eyes were red, but something inside her looked different. Lighter. She walked straight toward me and wrapped both arms around me without saying a word. I held her as tightly as I could. Finally, she whispered. I couldn't tell her I forgave her. I gently kissed the top of her head. "You didn't have to." She looked up at me. "But..." A tear rolled slowly down her cheek. I told her I loved her. Behind us, the hospital room door remained slightly open. Through the narrow gap, I caught one final glimpse of Hannah's mother, quietly, smiling with tears in her eyes. In that single moment, I understood something I'd spent the entire week searching for. The deleted message had never hidden another man. It had hidden a daughter who wasn't ready to say goodbye to the family she had spent years convincing herself she no longer had. The drive home was almost completely silent. Not because Hannah had nothing to say, but because neither of us wanted to disturb what had happened inside that hospital room. Some moments become smaller the moment you try to explain them. As we crossed the Fremont Bridge, Hannah rested her head gently against the passenger window, watching Portland disappear beneath the evening lights. "She fell asleep before I left," she whispered. "Do you think she'll still be there tomorrow?" I glanced toward her before returning my eyes to the road. "I don't know." She nodded slowly. "Neither do I." We reached home just after sunset. Murphy greeted us at the front door with his usual excitement, his tail wagging so hard that his entire body seemed to move with it. Hannah knelt to hug him, burying her face in his golden fur for several seconds. When she finally stood again, she smiled through tired eyes. He always knows when someone needs comforting. I laughed quietly. I think that's his full-time job. That night we sat together on the living room floor instead of turning on the television. Between us rested the cream-colored envelope containing the letter Hannah had shown me the night before. For a long time, neither of us reached for it. Finally, Hannah picked it up. "There are 16 more. Will you read them?" I asked. She stared at the envelope before answering. "Someday." She looked at me. Not because I owe anyone forgiveness. She gently placed the letter back on the coffee table. Because I deserve to know the whole story. Early the next morning, Hannah's phone rang before sunrise. She answered immediately. I watched her expression change almost the moment she heard the voice on the other end. "Thank you for calling," she whispered. "We'll come right away." She slowly lowered the phone. Tears gathered in her eyes before she spoke. "She passed away this morning." The room became perfectly still. Hannah didn't cry immediately. She simply stood there holding the silent phone as if she hadn't yet caught up with the words she had just heard. Then, without warning, she collapsed into my arms. I held her while years of grief, anger, regret, and love poured out all at once. None of it belonged only to today. Much of it had been waiting for 15 years. Later that morning, we arrived at the funeral home where Eli was quietly completing paperwork. The moment he saw Hannah, he walked toward her slowly, uncertain whether he should hug her. Hannah answered the question herself. She stepped forward first. Eli wrapped his arms around his sister, and for the first time since I had known either of them looked like strangers anymore. "She wasn't alone," Eli whispered. "Not at the end." Hannah nodded against his shoulder. "Thank you." During the memorial service, only a handful of people filled the small chapel. A nurse from the cancer center, 2 neighbors from their mother's apartment building, an elderly woman from her church, the florist who had supplied the white lilies, and us. The minister invited anyone who wished to share a memory. No one moved at first. Then Hannah quietly stood. She walked to the front of the room holding nothing in her hands. For a long time, she began softly, "I believe that remembering only the worst parts of someone would protect me from being hurt again." She looked toward the simple wooden casket surrounded by flowers she had arranged herself. But yesterday, she paused as emotion caught in her throat. I remember my mother singing while she braided my hair before school. A few gentle smiles appeared throughout the room. She couldn't sing very well. Even Eli laughed quietly through his tears. Hannah smiled too. For years, I convinced myself that memory wasn't enough. She looked down for a moment before lifting her eyes again. Today I realized it was never the whole story. She took a slow breath. My mother failed in ways that changed all of our lives. The chapel remained silent. But before she failed, Hannah's voice softened. She loved us. Tears rolled freely down her face now. And before she died, she glanced toward Eli. She found the courage to tell us she was sorry. No dramatic applause followed. Only quiet tears filling a room where forgiveness had finally become possible. After the service ended, people slowly drifted outside into the cool Oregon afternoon. As Hannah and I prepared to leave, Eli approached carrying a worn cardboard box. "Mom asked me to give you this," he said. Hannah carefully opened the lid. Inside were dozens of drawings, birthday cards, school certificates, faded photographs, and handmade Mother's Day gifts she had created as a child. Every single one had been carefully preserved. Resting on top was a folded note written in the same shaky handwriting as the letters. Hannah unfolded it with trembling hands. It contained only one sentence. I never stopped believing that one day you might come home, so I kept every piece of you I had left. Hannah closed her eyes and held the note against her heart. Standing beside her, I finally understood why one deleted message had changed everything. If Hannah had never found the courage to answer that final call, these memories would have remained buried forever. And some goodbyes can never be spoken after the silence becomes permanent. The days after the funeral passed more quietly than either of us expected. Grief did not arrive like a storm. It settled gently into our routines, appearing in small moments we never anticipated. Hannah would reach for her phone, as though she might call someone, before remembering there was no one left to answer. Sometimes I caught her standing in the flower shop, holding white lilies a little longer than usual before arranging them for a customer. She never said why. She didn't have to. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the funeral, Eli knocked on our front door carrying another cardboard box. "I found this while cleaning out Mom's apartment," he said. "I think Hannah should have it." Hannah carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of old journals, recipe cards stained with flour, family photo albums, and a small wooden jewelry box. She hesitated before opening it. Resting inside was a delicate silver necklace with a tiny pressed forget-me-not flower seal beneath glass. Hannah's eyes widened immediately. "I thought this was gone." Eli smiled softly. "Mom kept it after you left." Hannah gently lifted the necklace into her hands. "Dad gave this to her before I was born." Beneath the necklace lay a folded envelope with Hannah's name written across the front. Unlike the 17 letters, this one looked newer. The paper hadn't yellowed with age. Hannah slowly unfolded it. Asterisk, "My beautiful girl. If you're reading this, then Eli finally convinced you to come see me. Thank you. There's one thing I need you to know before you remember me only as the woman I became. You were never the reason our family broke apart. Children spend far too much of their lives believing they should have been able to save adults. You never carried that responsibility. I did. I hope one day you stop carrying it too." Asterisk. Hannah stopped reading. Her shoulders began trembling. I quietly moved beside her without saying a word. She leaned into me, still holding the letter in one hand and the necklace in the other. "I spent 15 years believing I should have stayed," she whispered. "I kept wondering if things would have been different." Eli slowly shook his head. "She never blamed you." He looked toward the window before continuing. "She blamed herself every single day." Hannah wiped away another tear. "I wasted so many years being angry." Eli gave a tired smile. "Maybe." Then he gently added, "But you didn't waste yesterday." Silence settled over the room. Not the painful silence that had haunted our marriage only weeks earlier. This silence felt peaceful. Healing often arrives without announcing itself. It simply becomes easier to breathe. Later that evening, after Eli had gone home, Hannah and I sat together on the back porch overlooking the garden. She wore the silver necklace for the first time since I had known her. The tiny forget-me-not flower caught the last rays of sunlight. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Always." She rested her head against my shoulder. "Do you know why I really deleted that text?" I looked at her. "I thought it was because you weren't ready." She nodded slowly. "That's part of it." She smiled sadly. "But there was another reason." She reached for my hand. When that message appeared, she took a deep breath. "My first instinct wasn't to hide it from you." I listened quietly. "My first instinct was to hand you my phone." She looked down at our intertwined fingers. "Then I imagined you reading those words before I had accepted them myself." Her voice became almost a whisper. "I knew you'd try to fix everything." I smiled faintly. "Probably." She laughed softly through her tears. "You would have driven me to the hospital that very night." "Yes." "You would have told me forgiveness couldn't wait." I nodded. "Probably." She squeezed my hand, and I wasn't ready. We sat together watching the river in silence for several moments. Finally, Hannah looked at me again. Deleting that message gave me 3 more days. 3 days to remember who I wanted to be before I walked into that hospital. I thought back to the version of myself from only a few weeks earlier. The man who had almost looked through her phone. The man who had followed her instead of trusting her. The man who believed one missing message meant his marriage was falling apart. If I had seen it that night, I admitted quietly, I would have made the decision for you. Hannah nodded. Exactly. She smiled with a tenderness I had never fully understood until that moment. Instead, you let me make it for myself. I looked at the fading sunset stretching across the Columbia River. Suddenly, the title of our story finally made sense. My wife had deleted one message. Not to protect a lie, not to hide another man, but to give herself enough time to become the daughter she wanted to be before saying goodbye. And in doing so, she had unknowingly saved something else as well. She had saved the marriage that might never have survived if fear had spoken before understanding. Spring arrived earlier than expected that year. The cherry trees lining our neighborhood streets bloomed almost overnight, replacing the gray skies that had seemed to follow us for weeks. One Saturday morning, Hannah stood in the garden planting forget-me-not flowers beneath the front porch. I watched her from the kitchen window while making coffee. Murphy lay beside her, occasionally lifting his head whenever she spoke to him, as though he understood every word. When I carried 2 mugs outside, Hannah looked up and smiled. Perfect timing. I handed her one of the cups before sitting beside her on the porch steps. I thought you preferred roses. She gently brushed a little soil from her hands. I still do. She looked down at the tiny blue flowers she had just planted. But these remind me that remembering doesn't always have to hurt. We sat quietly, watching a light breeze move through the garden. It had been almost 3 months since Hannah's mother passed away. During those months, something inside our home had changed. Not because life had become easier, because we had finally stopped protecting each other from the truth. One evening each week, Hannah and Eli met for dinner. At first, their conversations felt careful, almost formal, as though they were 2 strangers trying to remember how siblings were supposed to speak. Slowly, old memories returned. Childhood stories. Their father's terrible jokes. Summer spent camping along the Oregon coast before everything had fallen apart. They laughed more with each passing week. One afternoon, Hannah came home carrying a faded photo album Eli had discovered in storage. We spent hours at turning fragile pages filled with birthdays, school plays, Christmas mornings, and vacations taken before addiction slowly stole those ordinary joys from their family. Hannah stopped at one photograph in particular. She couldn't have been older than 8. She sat on her father's shoulders while her mother stood beside them laughing. Eli, only a teenager then, was making an exaggerated face behind the camera. Hannah touched the edge of the photograph with her fingertips. For years, she whispered, I convinced myself we were never this family. She smiled sadly. But we were. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You didn't lose your childhood. She looked at me. You lost part of it. She nodded slowly. That's different. Later that month, the flower shop hosted its annual Mother's Day workshop. Every table filled with daughters, mothers, grandmothers, and children arranging spring bouquets together. Hannah moved gracefully through the room, helping customers choose flowers while soft piano music played in the background. Near closing time, a little girl approached the counter holding a bouquet almost as large as she was. Miss Hannah? Yes. My mommy says these flowers are for you. Hannah looked surprised. For me? The little girl nodded proudly. She said, sometimes the people who help other families deserve flowers too. Hannah looked toward the back of the shop. Standing near the entrance was one of the nurses from the cancer center. The same nurse who had cared for Hannah's mother during her final weeks. She smiled warmly before quietly leaving without waiting for thanks. Hannah held the bouquet against her chest for a long moment. That evening, she placed those flowers beside the framed photograph of her parents in our living room. Not because everything had been forgiven, but because love had finally become stronger than regret. A few weeks later, while cleaning my office at the college, I found the leather sketchbook Hannah had given me on our anniversary. Most of its pages were still blank. I carried it home and placed it on the dining table. I think it's time, I said. Hannah looked at me curiously. Time for what? I opened to the first empty page. Across the top, I wrote 4 simple words. The house we build. Hannah smiled. Another design project? I shook my head. A different kind. Beneath the title, I wrote our first rule. Nothing important waits until later. Hannah quietly took the pen from my hand and added a second line beneath it. No truth is too heavy to carry together. She looked up at me. Think we can live by those? I smiled. I think we already started. She closed the sketchbook and rested her hand over mine. Looking at her, I realized something that had taken nearly our entire marriage to understand. Trust is not built because two people never keep secrets. Trust is built because when the truth finally arrives, they choose to face it together instead of letting it pull them apart. Almost a year passed before either of us mentioned the deleted message again. By then, life had found its rhythm once more. Hannah's flower shop was busier than ever, especially during wedding season. My students had begun teasing me because I smiled more during lectures than I used to. Murphy had grown older, his muzzle turning almost completely white, yet he still greeted us at the front door every evening as though we'd been gone for months instead of hours. Some things never stopped feeling like home. One warm June afternoon, Hannah asked me to help reorganize a storage closet at the flower shop. We spent hours sorting ribbons, vases, candles, and boxes of decorations left over from years of weddings. Near the very back of the highest shelf, Hannah found an old cardboard box labeled personal in faded black marker. I haven't opened this since we moved the shop, she said. We carried it to the work table and lifted the lid together. Inside were photographs, receipts, greeting cards, and an old smartphone wrapped carefully in a soft cloth. Hannah picked it up and laughed quietly. I completely forgot about this. Your old phone? She nodded. The one I had before we were married. Curiosity got the better of us. After charging it for a few minutes, the screen slowly came back to life. The wallpaper showed a photograph of Hannah, Eli, and their parents taken many years before everything fell apart. Hannah smiled sadly before opening the message archive. Thousands of conversations appeared. Friends, customers, former classmates. Then she stopped scrolling. There it was. The conversation from the week that had nearly changed everything. She looked at me before quietly opening it. At the very top remained the notification she had deleted that Tuesday evening. Asterisk, the cancer has spread faster than expected. If Hannah wants to say goodbye, she may not have much time left. Asterisk, beneath it were dozens of messages she had never answered. Not because she didn't care, because she hadn't known how. Hannah slowly locked the phone and placed it back on the table. I used to think deleting that message was the weakest thing I'd ever done. I reached across the table and took her hand. Do you still think that? She looked at me for a long moment before shaking her head. No, she smiled gently. I think it was the first honest thing I did. I raised an eyebrow. She laughed softly. Not honest with anyone else. She placed a hand over her heart. Honest with myself. We closed the shop early that evening and drove to the small cemetery overlooking the river where her mother had been buried. Eli was already there replacing fresh flowers beside the headstone. He stepped aside as Hannah quietly knelt in front of the grave. She placed a small bouquet of forget-me-nots beside the stone before speaking almost in a whisper. I'm doing okay. A light breeze moved through the trees. Eli's doing okay too. She smiled. You'd probably worry less if you could see us now. None of us said very much after that. We didn't need to. Some conversations continue long after words have ended. As the sun began to set, Hannah slipped her hand into mine while we walked back toward the car. Can I ask you something? She said. Always. If you could go back. She looked toward the quiet hillside behind us. Would you want to leave that message on my phone? I thought about it for a long moment. About the suspicion, the fear, the sleepless nights, the hospital, the funeral, the forgiveness, the family we almost misunderstood. Finally, I smiled. No. She looked surprised. Why? I gently squeezed her hand. Because if I had seen it that night, I would have tried to rescue you before you were ready to rescue yourself. Tears filled her eyes. And I continued quietly, that would have been the first real crack in our marriage. She leaned against my shoulder as we stood together beneath the fading evening sky. For years, I believed that trust meant never keeping anything from the person you love. I understand something different now. Love is not measured by how quickly every truth is spoken. It is measured by whether two people still choose each other when the truth finally arrives. Hannah deleted one message. It gave her 3 days to find the courage she needed. It gave her the chance to say goodbye to her mother as a daughter instead of as a frightened child. And without either of us realizing it at the time, it gave our marriage something even more valuable than certainty. It gave us the opportunity to replace suspicion with understanding before either one had the chance to become permanent. Sometimes the strongest relationships are not saved by the words we say immediately. Sometimes they are saved because love is patient enough to wait until the heart is finally ready to tell the truth. The end.